Please stand by. YouTube is doing its thing. Let me share up my screen that we will be studying from. Right. There, that's all in place. There we go. Okay. It is just 12 o'clock, so I will give it just a second. I know that it takes a while for the YouTube announcements to go out and people to log in and all those other good things. So we are going to continue in a sense from where we left off last week. Last week we talked about Ishmael and the issue with Hagar and her running away after Sarah, or Sarai at the time, was treating her so harshly. And now we are going to talk about the final separation. That is to say, Hagar came back after that while she was still pregnant. But now we are reaching the point where Ishmael and Hagar are both going to be sent away permanently. And so the question becomes why? But more importantly, what is the underlying essence of this separation? And what can we learn from it, not just about the past and the behavior of our ancestors, but of course, what also can it mean for us in the modern world? So with that, we're going to dive in. We are here in chapter 21 of the book of Exodus. Very famous chapter, perhaps only made more famous by the chapter that comes immediately afterwards, but this is our focus for this year. So we begin with verse 1. And Adonai took account of Sarah as he had said. Adonai dealt with Sarah as he had spoken. So here, finally, Sarah will be able to have the child that was foretold when he spoke to Adonai and when the angels visited and all of the other things that have led up to this point. This is finally the time. Sarah became pregnant and bore Abraham a son in his old age at a set time of which God had spoken to him, remembering the foretelling. And Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore to him, Yitzchak, meaning he laughs. Notice that it's emphasizing that it's not just his son, because he has another son, Ishmael, but it is being specified that this is the one that came from Sarah. That's rather critical for what's about to happen, and of course it is very critical for the Akedah, the binding and near sacrifice of Isaac, which takes place under the harsh reality that at that point there is only one son left in the household because of the events of this chapter. Verse 4. And Abraham circumcised Yitzchak, his son, at 8 days old, as God had commanded him. So far, everything is proceeding as planned. The child came as planned. The circumcision was as commanded. So far, so good. Now, Abraham was 100 years old when Yitzchak, his son, was born to him, and that was all considered old and exceptional. Now, Sarah said, God has made laughter for me. All who hear of it will laugh for me. Again, playing on the idea of Yitzchak, which is the name of the child and is based off the root for laughter. And she said, who would have declared to Abraham, Sarah will nurse sons? Well, I have borne him a son in his old age. And that is quite exceptional. Now, at this point, everything is going great. First 7 verses of chapter 21 is a lovely little unit. And if we just said, and they lived happily ever after, it would be very satisfying. But of course, it would not be very illustrative. It would not be very instructive, nor would it capture what really happened. So we have to go into verse 8. The child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great drink fest on the day that Yitzchak was weaned. It's very normal in the ancient world. Weaning took place at a much later age than it does now, since that was a primary food source for children in a food scarce environment. But the weaning happened and they made a feast. So now we know that Isaac is that old, and now it gets into the darkness. Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian woman, whom she had borne to Avraham, laughing. Okay, so Mitzachek is obviously a play on Isaac's name. And the question becomes, what was Yishmael laughing about? Well, we don't know exactly. That is to say, the text itself is not explicit. There are a number of interpretations. One is the mitzachek here is building off the other meaning of the root word that we see that isn't laughing, which comes in the story of Isaac and Rivka later on, where it seems to be some level of physical intimacy, not actual intercourse, but some other level of kissing or fondling or some other level of foreplay that mitzachek has a sexual connotation as well. So it could be, say our commentators, that Ishmael was doing something that was sexually inappropriate either to Isaac or to someone else, but in either event was displaying a big problem for the family. Alternatively, other commentaries suggest that the mitzachek here was a straight up laugh, and that Ishmael was laughing at Isaac now that he was old enough to understand that since Ishmael was the firstborn, that he would be the primary beneficiary of Avraham, that Yitzhak, although he came from the favorite wife, was going to get the short end of the stick once it came time for things to be divided up. Again, mocking Isaac for who he was and his status. Others claim that this was a playful but near lethal activity between the brothers, with what we know about Ishmael being an archer, basically trying to recreate the William Tell episode, although William Tell obviously is 1,000 and some year later, and that Sarah was alarmed at the recklessness of Ishmael and the potential harm that could come to Isaac. We don't know exactly, but what we do know is that it was significant enough that Sarah is going to demand that there be a separation. And that's what we get to in verse 10. She said to Avraham, "Drive out this maidservant and her son, for the son of this maidservant shall not share inheritance with my son, with Yitzhak." Obviously, the second part of this verse is the inspiration behind the idea that the laughter of Ishmael was connected to the inheritance priorities, but that is, of course, supposition. Verse 11, the matter was exceedingly bad in Abraham's eyes because of his son. And after all, he did seem to dearly love Ishmael, whatever his feelings might have been personally about Hagar. But Ishmael, at least, Avraham seems to have a depth of feeling for. And sending away Ishmael, it cuts him to the quick. Verse 12, but God said to Avraham, "Do not let it be bad in your eyes concerning the lad and concerning your maidservant. In all that Sarah says to you, hearken to her voice. For it is through Yitzhak that seed will be called by your name." So verse 12 clarifies what had already been implied in our discussion last week, that it will be through Yitzhak that the brit, that is the religious element, not just the material benefits of Abraham's blessing, will be carried forward. And thus, if Ishmael is sent off, it will not be the end of Abraham's line, and that it is an appropriate and fine decision to make at this moment. But also, the son of the maidservant, a nation will I make of him, for he is your seed. As we saw in our discussion last week, Ishmael is not going to be left with nothing. He will still have an inheritance. It just will not be the brit, the main covenantal inheritance. Avraham started early in the morning. He took some bread and a skin of water and gave them to Hagar, placing them upon her shoulder together with the child, and sent her away. She went off and roamed in the wilderness of Beersheba. Now, verse 14 or even verse 13 could have been a fine conclusion for this section. Notice that we are in sort of 7 verse lumps of text that are going through here, very evenly balanced. That would have made it perfectly fine. By Hagar and Ishmael, good luck, don't worry, God will take care of you. But they could have exited stage left from the narrative that is the focus of the Torah. But the focus of the Torah is not only on the things that happened in the immediate surroundings of our Avotenu, of our ancestors. It is also about the periphery as well. And thus, we should care what happened to Hagar and Ishmael afterwards. And so the Torah will tell us. The water in the skin came to an end, so she threw the child under one of the bushes, and went and sat by herself at a distance as far away as a bow shot, for she said to herself, "Let me not see the child die." She sat at a distance and lifted up her voice and wept. So everyone is moved to feel the despair and the loss of hope at this point that she and the child are going to die. And so we are surprised and reassured in verse 17, but God heard the voice of the lad. God's messenger called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What ails you, Hagar? Do not be afraid, for God has heard the voice of the lad there where he is." That God is indeed going to act upon the promise that he made to Hagar directly in the first encounter she had with the divine, and through the promise that he made to Abraham as well. "Arise, lift up the lad and grasp him with your hand, for a great nation will I make of him." She opened her eyes and she saw a well of water. She went, filled the skin with water, and gave the lad to drink. So again, we have the survival of Ishmael and Hagar. We have the reassurance directly to him and his mother that he will be maintained. This could be another place where we could fade to black and return to the main thrust of our story, which is, of course, Abraham and Sarah. But the Torah feels there is more we should know. Verse 20. "And God was with the lad as he grew up. He settled in the wilderness and became an archer, a bowman. He settled in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took him a wife from the land of Egypt." So we see here in the end, let's just go ahead and line that up a little bit, that what was mentioned earlier about him being in the wilderness here is coming true. We see again that he is indeed a archer, as was intimated in the earlier blessing, and of course is the source of the idea that he was perhaps doing some mock archery with his brother that was potentially lethal. And we also see that he is settling down, that he is getting married. And we have the phrase that his mother took him a wife from the land of Egypt. And that's going to be the axis of our conversation. You'll notice again, we've reached our conclusion here at verse 21, which makes this a very nice set of three sections for the story, and brings it to its conclusion, and the rest of the chapter deals with a different topic. So what are we to make of this notion that he is settling down, that he is getting married? Is there a significance to the fact that his mother is finding an Egyptian wife for him? And what are we to make of this notion of separation between Ishmael and Yitzhak? Surely if he is a terrible person, as many of the Midrashim hint, then we should not be rooting for him. On the other hand, if he is a child of Abraham, then we should be rooting for him. And what will his destiny be in this at this time and in this place? Well, that's where we're going to focus our conversation about that separation, why it was necessary, and what it really meant. But before we dive into that, if there's any other questions or comments on the text, let me know. Okay, so here we are then with Rashi. And he is such a great person to start with, because indeed he often will tackle the pshat, the straightforward meaning of a concept, in a way that will get the ball rolling for our conversation. So of course, we're focusing here on the idea that he married a woman that his mother had found for him from the land of Egypt. Now, why is that important? Well, this is from the place where she, Hagar, was brought up. Now, why is that important? Well, we know that she's from Egyptian because we saw back in Genesis 16, and she, meaning Sarah in context, had an Egyptian handmaid. That is what the popular proverb says. And this is taken from Bereshit Rabbah, Genesis Rabbah, one of the early Midrashim. Throw a stick in the air, and it will fall back to its element. You also see similar aphorisms of birds of a feather flock together. But here there is a hint of criticism, a hint of an edge to it. Egypt is not often looked at fondly in the Jewish conception. We have some bad memories, if you will, of our time in Egypt, and it was considered to be a thorn in our side historically for many, many generations after, and it was also considered to be a byword for idolatry. So there is a hint here that you can take Hagar out of Egypt, but you can't take Egypt out of Hagar. That you can remove her from Egypt and put her into the household of Abraham, and yet she is still going to revert back into the Egyptian ways, and she will look for an Egyptian wife for her son at that time. That is one of the ways that we can understand this teaching in this point. However, this doesn't tell us exactly why the separation was needed. It perhaps is hinting that she was still too Egyptian in her thought, and her son was going to be likewise, but it's not very explicit of why the separation will be needed or what we can learn from his marriage of an Egyptian woman. So we'll look at Radak, one of the later commentaries. She took a wife for him from her own family, seeing that he had become separated from his father's family. So Radak is trying to read this in a more psychological, sociological way. He's saying, look, if you are a person all alone and you have been cast out from the only family that you knew, as Ishmael was, then you're going to seek other family. Well, Hagar would have had other family, so therefore it is no surprise, says Radak, that she found a wife for him among the Egyptians. And in fact, we can probably guess that it would be from her family. Indeed, we will see that played out again over the next 2 generations of Abraham's descendants, as we see Isaac being married to someone from Abraham's family, and as we see Joseph being married to a couple people from Abraham's extended family. Now, what does Radak think of this? It is proper for people to marry into members of their family, as a stronger bond of mutual love is liable to be forged between men and women of similar backgrounds, such as being members of the same clan. Please note that Radak is saying clan. He is not saying that brothers and sisters, God forbid, should get married, but he is talking about a broader definition of family, whether it be, and in those days it was considered fine, cousins, uncles and nieces sometimes, and obviously second cousins and the like. That was considered to be proper and even recommended in many communities, not just the Middle East, but in many parts of the world, as a way of guaranteeing that the members of the family would be loyal and strongly bound to one another. Now, Radak is, of course, hinting here that since Hagar and her son Ishmael were just kicked out of their family, meaning the family of Abraham, then they would be especially interested in ensuring that their new family would be one that was more permanent, more durable, that would be built upon links that were not as transient as the ones that were forged with Abraham and Sarah. In some ways, this is a repudiation of Abraham and Sarah's behavior of kicking them out, of forcing them to now find better family, more loyal family. And of course, it is also an explanation and justification for the way that the wives were found for Isaac and then later for Jacob. The idea being that that is a laudable activity, and if it was good for the children of Abraham through the Brit, through the covenant, then it is good for Ishmael as well. So Radak is not saying that the separation is necessarily the fault of Hagar or Ishmael, and he's not saying it wasn't either. He seems to be a little bit more neutral, but he is trying to explain just in context why it might be that she was marrying an Egyptian to her son, and indeed trying to read between the lines that this was in response to the upheaval that they had gone through. But again, that's not a great deal of depth, and so we will have to continue to dig further on this story. And the first thing we need to see is perhaps this separation was much more to do with the nature of Ishmael than even Hagar. And to do that, we notice that it said in our passage that they are now in the wilderness of Paran. And as is argued, this is what was predicted from Genesis 16:12, where it says that he will have the character of this Pere Adam. Now, this Pere word is a little bit confusing. Rashbam is using it here as a almost a rhyming variation of the word paran. But what Pereh can mean can be just wild. The wilderness is known for being unrestrained, as having no limits on it because nobody governs there. And there aren't enough people there to form the nucleus of a society and culture which will hem in behavior for better and occasionally for worse. But it can also mean, and indeed is often used, as in Jeremiah and Job, to mean a donkey. This is why oftentimes you will see the phrase that he will be Pereh Adam as being translated as being he will be a wild ass of a man. Adam, of course, means person more than man, but English translations tend to be a little bit more classically English rather than modern English. But the phrase Pereh Adam can give us a little bit of a hint, and indeed some commentators try to blend those concepts together, that it is not just that he would be a wild ass of a man, which sounds horrific in modern English, but instead it would be that he was like the wild ass of the wilderness. And wild ass here is not a pejorative per se, but instead it simply means unconstrained by the normal bounds of civilization and cultures that surrounded them. And that can be good when one is escaping from many of the problems of those ancient societies. But of course, it also seems to lend itself towards violent behavior, because if you are not constrained by culture and community, then why not use your force to take what you can and act in that way? So again, we're now seeing a little bit more of the character that could be implying why this separation was needed, if this was going to be the character of Ishmael. Even if he was not going to be an idolater of a true Egyptian style, even if it wasn't about inheritance rights, it could simply be that his mitzachek, his playing, was going beyond the limits of what was acceptable, because that was his character at that time. Now, the Ninei Halacha comes at this from a different angle. This section is read during Rosh Hashanah, and Pnei Halacha, in this portion of his book on Halacha, is talking about the Yamim Noraim, the days of awe, the high holidays, and he wants to know why this section was chosen to be read. Indeed, I have tried to explain and discuss this many, many times as in the tenure of my rabbinate, because it does seem like a strange reading for day one of Rosh Hashanah. Yes, the birth of Isaac is certainly understandable. That's very nobling and very inspiring, but that's only 7 verses. And the rest of the Torah reading is built around this concept of Ishmael's banishment. So that's his trouble of why are we reading this on the first day of Rosh Hashanah? So let me let him speak for himself. On the first day of Rosh Hashanah, we read the story of Yitzchak's birth and the banishment of Hagar and Ishmael. And the Haftarah is the story of Hannah and the birth of Shmuel. That's referenced in Shulchan Aruch. This is appropriate, as 3 righteous women conceived on Rosh Hashanah, according to rabbinic tradition. Our matriarch Sarah, mother of Yitzchak, our matriarch Rachel, mother of Yosef, and Hannah, mother of the prophet Shmuel. And this is taken from Rosh Hashanah 10b in the Talmud, is where they discuss this notion of the 3 having the conception on Rosh Hashanah. These women were so exceptionally righteous that they were destined to give birth to children whose souls were radically new. These souls could not be born naturally, which is why their mothers remained barren for so long. All of these women had different fertility issues that was exceptionally explained throughout the Torah. It was only through the renewal of Rosh Hashanah that they could be helped. So Pnei Halacha is going with the notion that there was something mystical on Rosh Hashanah that allowed for this newness, this new level of nefesh to be achieved, this new level of soul to be achieved, and that's why the tradition says that these were conceived on Rosh Hashanah. So, on the one hand, that makes perfect sense that we would talk about the conception then of Isaac if this is considered to be a Rosh Hashanah story, even more than just the fact that Isaac was instrumental in the generations of the covenant. However, as I said, that's only 7 verses. So most of the Torah reading, as Peninei Halacha says, tells of the banishment of Ishmael. We can learn 2 principles from this. So we have to cover the rest of the Torah reading. 1, despite the pain that it caused, the banishment of Ishmael was not in any way immoral. Had it been, the sages would not have ordained its reading on Rosh Hashanah, as they would not have wanted to provide the accusers with material. All right, so his first explanation is that since this was established as the Torah reading, we have to understand that nothing that was done was immoral. And that is because if it were immoral, then reading out a litany of our crimes, or the crimes of our ancestors in this case, would be almost like giving the prosecution evidence in order to convict us. And as Rosh Hashanah is the day of judgment, where we are being weighed before God, we really don't want to give the prosecutor any more ammunition. And so clearly this cannot be hinting that there was something done that was immoral. Now, that is a relief. It means that when we read through the story, we have to understand that everything must have been done for a good reason, and it's our job to understand and find out what that reason is, which we're going to continue doing. But it also means, and this is a sort of a digression, but a very important one, that our ancestors did at some point do things that were unworthy of them, that they were not completely blameless in all ways at all times, that there were mistakes made in our history. And even if we are going to say that this story is without flaw, that the behavior of Abraham and Sarah were entirely correct, as Peninei Halacha is arguing, we still have to understand that in other stories there are mistakes. And this is one of the hallmarks of Jewish textual traditions, is we retain the story of the mistakes, both of people that are thoroughly wicked, but also the mistakes of people that are righteous, to remind ourselves that the righteous do sometimes make mistakes, and that we can learn much from that. However, part 2 is what Peninei Halacha is really coming to say. It's his main point. Especially on Rosh Hashanah, the Day of Judgment, it is important to distinguish between the Jewish people and the rest of the nations, who are not willing to accept upon themselves the great and awe-inspiring mission of repairing the world under the kingship of God, just as it was necessary to separate Ishmael from Yisrael. So Peninei Halacha says that we have to also reflect on this day that we do have a special destiny, we do have a special direction, and that is not 100% universal. Now, the primary reason for that lack of universality is that others, especially in his generation and still many, many millions in the modern world, choose to act in ways that contradict what is right and proper for the world, what is according to the path that God has tried to lay out for all humanity, which doesn't mean that they're not Jewish. It just means that, well, they're behaving abominably. And that is something that has to be remarked and understood. We don't give a free pass for morality to the rest of the world simply because they're not Jewish, nor do we expect them to become Jewish in order to be moral. Someone can be and must be moral even when not Jewish. And that is one of our most basic understandings and beliefs about the world. So at Rosh Hashanah in particular, where we are feeling judged, we need to be thinking about exactly how we are behaving in our path, in our ways, not thinking that we need to mimic the behavior of those around us, which for much of history has been horrible, but instead thinking of how we can mimic the proper behavior that Adonai has set out for us. That means we need to be in a different mindset than the rest of the world. We need to have that distinction, that separation in our mind. And that is we are reminded of this by having the story of Ishmael and Isaac, but Israel in the broader sense, being separated at this time, to recognize that there are times when we need to be alone, if you will, as ourselves, as members of this nation, in order to pursue our destiny, our journey. All right. Any questions or comments before we press on? Okay. Now the next section is an extended retelling of many of the stories from Midrashim into a more cohesive narrative. The Midrashim themselves, as you've seen, I'm sure, in many of our studies together, are usually tidbits here and there, a phrase, a sentence, maybe a paragraph of a retelling or an elaboration on a particular element of the text. Sefer HaYashar, which is what we're going to be looking at next, takes from all of those disparate and sometimes contradictory texts, because many rabbis had different traditions of what we should learn from each piece, and tries to weave them together into a more comprehensive, cohesive retelling. It will sound a little bit more like what a modern narrative book would sound like if it were including all of these other elements. Now, as I'm sure many of you who are familiar with my teaching know, I am generally very skeptical of this attempt, because I think the Torah is meant to be understood not in a pure, simple, modern narrative, comprehensive sort of way, but through the act of sifting and sorting and analyzing and wrestling with each piece to see how it fits together in a broader puzzle that does not lend itself easily to comprehension. There is a reason we have struggled with Torah for 3,000 years. However, that being said, things like Sefer HaYashar can sometimes give us a bird's eye view of a common theme that is woven through many of the Midrashim, and sometimes allow us to reflect on things that get lost when we are examining the details. So with that as an introduction, let's go ahead and begin. And after this, meaning after Ishmael's banishment, Ishmael journeyed with his mother and his wife and his children. After a long time, Abraham said to Sarah, "I will go and see my son Ishmael, for my heart yearns after him, and I have not seen him for such a long time." So first and foremost, note that the Midrashim, in many places, says that Abraham continued to have a relationship with Ishmael even after his banishment. So this is something that is often lost in many of the modern texts that select from the Midrashim, that pick and choose which Midrash they want to share. They often forget that Ishmael may have been banished from the household of Abraham, but he wasn't banished from Abraham's heart, and he wasn't completely isolated from Abraham's presence, that Abraham went out of his way to maintain that connection. As far as textual support for this, well, we know that Ishmael is there when Abraham dies, that he is part of the burial process along with Isaac. We also have a very strong tradition that when Sarah dies, that Ishmael and Abraham are reunited, and indeed Hagar herself is reunited with Abraham at that time. So this shouldn't be as surprising as it sounds, but I know that it does sound surprising to many who encounter the concept for the first time. Recognize as well, then, that Abraham has not given up on Ishmael. So whatever the other commentaries have said about maybe Ishmael molesting someone, perhaps even Isaac, arguing about the inheritance, or even playing William Tell and potentially shooting near his other son, Abraham is still trying to be in Ishmael's life. This is something that's a very powerful statement for modern families, which often are very complicated in many different ways, of still trying to maintain that connection. So what happens? Abraham mounted one of his camels and rode into the wilderness in search of his son Ishmael, who we know lives in the Midbar, in the wilderness. Abraham reached Ishmael's tent about midday, and he found Ishmael's wife sitting in the tent with her children. But Ishmael and his mother were not with them. So, this is what happens when you can't call ahead to tell them you're visiting. And Abraham asked Ishmael's wife, "Where is your husband?" And she replied, "He is in the field, hunting." Abraham was all the while seated upon his camel, for he had sworn to Sarah that he would not dismount. So again, we get a little clue in the relationship here that Sarah may not have been 100% happy with Abraham going to visit Ishmael, or perhaps to visit Hagar, who she would have a specific form of jealousy about. And Abraham is he is honoring his wife's limitation while still making the effort to be with his son. And Abraham said to Ishmael's wife, "My daughter, would you please give me a drink of water? For I am very tired and fatigued from my journey." Hachnasat orchim, the mitzvah of being hospitable to travelers, is a cardinal aspect of Judaism, and it harkens all the way back to Abraham's behavior that we have seen demonstrated multiple times. So Abraham is basically testing to see whether or not this behavior is taking root in Ishmael's house as well. Ishmael's wife replied, saying, "We have in our tent neither water nor bread." And she still remained sitting in the tent without even doing as much as looking up to Abraham. So we are getting a very negative opinion here. And she was beating and cursing the children in the tent. And she cursed also her husband Ishmael, and she reviled him. So you have to sort of fill in the blanks here of her smacking their children around and saying horrible things, my good-for-nothing husband, blah, blah, blah. And Abraham is a witness to all of this, and is also being given zero hospitality. Abraham heard all she said concerning her children, who are his grandchildren after all, and Abraham was very angry, and it displeased him greatly. And Abraham called to the woman to come out for a minute from the tent. And the woman came forth, and she stood before Abraham, who was still sitting upon his camel. And Abraham said, "When your husband returns, tell him the following. A very old man from the land of the Philistines came to see you, and such was his appearance and his figure. I did not ask him who he was, and he told me to tell you, go and remove the nail of your tent and put another nail in its place." Essentially saying the tent peg that you have is faulty. And as anybody who's ever done camping with a tent that uses pegs, if you've got a faulty peg, there's a good chance your tent is going to collapse. You rely upon those. When you pull the ropes taut, it is going to need a strong peg, or else the tent will collapse. And here, tent, of course, is the household. You are relying upon this person, and at least in your absence, she is not doing what is necessary to support you and the person that I know you to be. So, as soon as Ishmael came back from the chase and entered his tent, when his wife repeated the message, Ishmael, hearing the words of his wife, knew that his father was there, and that his wife showed him no honor. And Ishmael understood what his father meant, and sent away his wife. So essentially, he divorces his wife because he's now been given information about her behavior behind his back that concerns him. And Ishmael went into the land of Canaan and took to himself a wife from there, and brought her home to his tent. At the end of 3 years, Abraham said once more, "I will go and look after my son Ishmael, for I have not seen his face for so many years." And he mounted his camel and rode into the wilderness and reached Ishmael's tent at midday, and he inquired of Ishmael. Again, we can see the pattern playing out again, and we are on tenterhooks to find out what's going to happen. The woman came forth from the tent. So she's already left the tent to greet him rather than just shouting through the flat. +1. "He is not here, my lord, for he went to hunt in the field and to drive the camels into the pasture." And the woman continued, saying, "Step in, my lord, into the tent and eat a morsel of bread, for surely you are fatigued from your journey." And Abraham replied, "It is impossible for me to do so, for I am in great haste to continue my journey. But give me a drink of water, for I am thirsty." So we can see here, to her credit, she was offering hospitality before it was even asked for. And Abraham, of course, couldn't come in, but he was happy to have some water. And the wife of Ishmael hurried into the tent, which we see Abraham himself do in earlier circumstances, and brought forth water and bread and set it before Abraham and forced him to eat, as any good host would ever do. You don't let someone go, even if they tell you that they don't want something to eat. You make them eat. And Abraham ate and drank, and it did his heart well, and he blessed his son Ishmael. And when he finished his meal, he praised the Lord. Right now, he knows that God is with his son Ishmael. And Abraham said, here it comes again, "When your husband returns, tell him the following. A very old man from the land of the Philistines came to see you, and such was his appearance and his figure, and he told me to tell you, the nail which you have placed into your tent is very good. never remove it from the tent. When Abraham had given her that message, he turned around and rode back the way he came to the land of the Philistines. And when Ishmael came back, his wife ran to meet him with joy and with a cheerful heart, and she repeated the message. Ishmael then knew that it was his father and that his wife had given him due honor and respect, and Ishmael praised the Lord. So Abraham's behavior here is to his credit, and Ishmael's behavior here is to his credit, and the second wife as well is showing the proper way to live. Now, what does this mean? Did Ishmael then not really have to leave? After all, here he seems to be able to not only encourage, but to strongly desire the approval of his father, but to also have a household that is run in ways that he saw his father's household run, with hospitality and kindness to all. So far from being the wild ass of a man, it seems like he is trying to be gracious. Now, is he still a hunter? Perhaps he's still behaving badly in other ways. Was he hunting for food, or was he hunting as a bandit? That could still be left ambiguous according to many of the commentaries. But what we do see here is that Ishmael is not a lost cause. That the separation, in fact, might have been needed for him as well as for Yitzhak. That perhaps Sarah was motivated by her love and defense of her own child, Isaac, but that perhaps what God was saying when he said, indeed, it is right for them to be separated, for Ishmael to go off, that Ishmael needed to have that distance. He needed to have that separation in order to recognize his own destiny. Perhaps he had been so fixated on his father's material goods, on the potential for inheritance, that he had forgotten to embrace the underlying hospitality that his father represented, which was born out of Abraham's understanding that with there being only one God that created all of the people of the earth, that hospitality is extended to all, because hospitality to any is like hospitality to a brother or sister. So we see a different lens, through a different lens here, that Ishmael is not this horrible wretch that is of disgusting character and a blight upon the world. He is a flawed character. But again, all of the characters of Torah are flawed in one way or another. And he is someone that has benefited from the separation in this telling. And we as well have benefited from our separation from Ishmael. That doesn't mean that there is no time to come together. As we discussed very briefly earlier on, when Abraham dies, Ishmael and Isaac come together. We know that Ishmael and Isaac and their descendants did continue to have contact and did continue to find times when they needed to be together and could be together in peace, even while they continued to have friction between them as well. And this is something that gives me hope and encourages me that while separation seems to be at the heart of the healthy relationship between these groups, that doesn't mean that separation is an iron-clad barrier. There is still room for permeability, for contact back and forth, and for a way to improve that relationship, even while maintaining the distinct culture, the distinct destiny, and the distinct societies. So hopefully that is something that we can all reflect upon, and hopefully we will be able to see a better relationship between the descendants of Isaac and the descendants of Ishmael. May it come soon in our day. With that, we will finish for today. I hope everybody is doing well. For those of you in town, look forward to seeing you in person tonight if you can make it. But if not, then I'll see you either on Shabbos or when we have a chance to get together again. Take care, everyone, and be well. Oh, come on.